Brutus had never known kindness. From the moment he opened his eyes as a small pup, the world had already decided his fate. He wasn't meant to be a companion, a loyal friend, or a family pet. No, Brutus was born to fight. The first thing he learned was pain. It came in different forms: blunt strikes, sharp stings, and the suffocating grip of a chain around his neck. The men who raised him never spoke to him gently, never ran their hands through his fur with warmth. Their touch was only meant to harden him, to shape him into something vicious. If he ever cowered, if he ever flinched, the consequences were swift and brutal. There was no room for weakness in their world, and so Brutus learned to survive. They trained him for one purpose. In the dimly lit basements where men gathered in whispered anticipation, where the scent of blood clung to the air like a permanent shadow, Brutus was thrown into the pit. The other dogs, just like him, bore the same scars, the same hollow look in their eyes. They didn't want to fight. None of them did. But they had no choice. Brutus fought because he had to, because not fighting meant pain. It meant days without food. It meant nights chained to a post, his body battered and broken, with no one to care if he lived or died. So he fought. He became everything they wanted him to be: strong, unyielding, merciless. And yet, deep inside, buried beneath layers of survival instincts, there was something else, something he barely understood. A memory, perhaps, a fleeting sensation of warmth. Maybe once, a long time ago, someone had cared for him. Maybe once he had belonged to someone who saw him as more than a weapon. But those thoughts had no place in his life. The past didn't matter. Only the next fight did. And then one day everything changed. The fight had started like any other. The crowd roared, the handlers released their grip, and Brutus found himself staring into the eyes of another dog. A younger one, leaner, weaker. Its ribs jutted out beneath its thin coat, its legs trembled. It was afraid. Brutus hesitated. He could feel the tension around him, the weight of every pair of eyes watching, waiting. He had been trained to recognize fear in his opponents. Fear meant weakness. Weakness meant victory. And yet something about the way this dog looked at him, pleading, desperate, made his muscles lock up. He didn't want to do this. A sharp command sliced through the air, his handler's voice filled with anger, impatience. Brutus knew what would come next if he refused, but something inside him, something buried so deep he hadn't even realized it was still there, clawed its way to the surface. He wouldn't do it. A second passed, then another. The handler screamed, and then there was pain, blinding, searing pain, as a heavy boot struck his side. Brutus yelped, stumbling, but he didn't fight back. He wouldn't do it. The blows rained down harder this time, again and again, until he collapsed, gasping, his body curled against the dirt floor. The cheers of the crowd had turned to angry shouts. The money exchanged hands. The fight was over. Brutus barely felt the chain tighten around his neck as they dragged him away. His mind was slipping, fading into nothingness. But even through the haze of agony, one thing was clear. If he stayed, he would die. The days that followed blurred together. His world shrank to the cold metal cage, the suffocating darkness, and the ache that never quite left his bones. He wasn't fed. He wasn't given water. He was nothing to them now, a failure, a waste. He had one purpose, and he had refused to fulfill it. So they left him to rot. Then came the night when fate intervened. The cage door wasn't locked. Whether it was a mistake or something more, Brutus would never know. But as the moon cast pale light through the cracks in the wooden walls, he realized what it meant. A chance. He didn't wait. With the last of his strength, he pushed the door open and bolted into the night. His paws pounded against the ground. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Not when the shouts echoed behind him, not when the sound of footsteps followed. He ran as though his life depended on it, because it did. And then, just like that, the world swallowed him whole. The streets became his new battleground. But this was a different kind of fight. Here there was no bell to signal the end, no hands pulling him away when the damage was done. Every day was a struggle, searching for scraps, dodging the kicks of strangers who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. People feared him. He saw it in their eyes. They didn't know his story. They didn't care that he had been a prisoner, that he had never chosen this life. To them, he was just another stray, another dangerous, unwanted creature. And so Brutus wandered. Through alleyways and empty streets, through the cold and the hunger and the aching loneliness, he wandered. There were moments, fleeting, painful moments, when he longed for something more. A warm hand on his head, a voice that wasn't shouting commands, a place where he wasn't just a fighter but something else. But those were foolish thoughts. The world had already decided his fate. Brutus was nothing more than a ghost, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a city that didn't want him. Until the day he heard laughter. It was small, light, a sound so pure and untainted that it made him stop. And when he lifted his head, when he looked past the rusted fence into the eyes of a child who didn't flinch, who didn't recoil in fear, something inside him shifted. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Brutus had stopped expecting kindness. He had learned, through endless nights curled up in cold alleyways and countless days spent dodging angry shouts and thrown objects, that the world did not want him. The world feared him. He had seen it in their eyes, how strangers would tense up the moment they spotted his broad frame and the deep scars etched into his fur. Pit bulls like him were not welcomed. They were seen as dangerous, unpredictable, a problem to be avoided, chased away, or worse. Brutus had lost count of how many doors had slammed in his face, how many times he had approached a human only to be met with fear. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. Sometimes he just wanted to rest, to steal a moment's peace. But peace was a privilege he had never known. One evening, hunger gnawed at him with a sharper edge than usual. The sun was setting, bathing the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, but Brutus barely noticed. His ribs ached from days without food. His paws, cracked and sore, dragged against the pavement. The city had turned him into a ghost, slipping from street to street, searching for scraps, avoiding danger. And then, through the suffocating silence of his loneliness, he heard it. Laughter. Brutus froze. It was small, high-pitched, bubbling with joy. Not the cruel, jeering laughter of men in darkened basements, the kind that came before a fight. No, this was something else. Lighter, softer. His ears perked, his tired body suddenly alert. He followed the sound, moving cautiously toward a rusted fence that lined the backyard of a quiet suburban home. There, playing in the grass, was a child. A boy. No older than 5 or 6, with a mop of messy blonde hair and bright, unafraid eyes. Brutus lowered himself instinctively, pressing his body close to the ground, his muscles tensed for rejection. This was a mistake. He shouldn't be here. The moment the boy saw him, he would scream. His parents would rush out, their voices sharp with fear, and Brutus would be forced to run again like he always did. But Oliver didn't scream. Instead, he stopped playing with his toy truck and turned toward the fence, his face lighting up with curiosity. Brutus held his breath. The boy tilted his head, studying him, not with the wary, calculating gaze of an adult, but with pure, open fascination. He didn't see a monster. He didn't see a stray to be feared. He simply saw a dog. Brutus was caught between instinct and something he couldn't quite name. He had been here before, standing at the edge of hope, only to have it ripped away. If he got too close, the boy would surely flinch. If he dared to step forward, he would hear the same terrified gasp that always came. But Oliver didn't flinch. He smiled. "Hi, puppy," the boy said, his voice soft and full of warmth. Brutus flinched at the word. Puppy. No one had ever called him that. He had been called other things. Beast, monster, a waste of space. Never puppy. He should have left. He should have turned and disappeared into the shadows before the inevitable rejection came. But his paws remained frozen in place. The boy scooted closer to the fence, his small fingers wrapping around the metal bars. His eyes shone with excitement, completely oblivious to the scars on Brutus's face, to the way his ribs pressed sharply against his skin. Brutus hesitated. He had two choices: run, as he always did, before the disappointment hit, or stay. It was foolish. He knew better. Hope had never led to anything but pain. But something about Oliver, his laughter, his lack of hesitation, made Brutus consider the unthinkable. He inched closer. The boy giggled, clapping his hands in delight. "You have big ears," he observed, tilting his head. "And a big nose." Brutus huffed softly. The boy wasn't wrong. He was only a few steps away from the fence now, close enough to see the freckles dusting Oliver's cheeks, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. And then, Oliver did something that changed everything. He reached out his tiny hand. Brutus stiffened. The offer was simple: no commands, no expectations. Just a small, open palm resting between the bars of the fence, waiting. Brutus's heart pounded. He had been here before, too. Hands had reached for him in the past. But those hands had only ever meant pain. This was different. Oliver wasn't trying to grab him. He wasn't trying to force anything. He was just there, his fingers barely brushing the air between them, waiting for Brutus to decide. Brutus inched forward. His nose hovered over the boy's hand. The scent was warm, unfamiliar. No sharp tang of fear. Just something soft, something safe. He lowered his head and, ever so gently, pressed his nose against Oliver's palm. The boy's face lit up. "You're not scary at all," he announced. Brutus blinked. He wasn't. It was such a simple statement, yet it hit Brutus harder than any blow he had ever endured. He had spent his entire life being something to be feared: a fighter, a stray, a problem. But to Oliver, he was just a dog. Brutus didn't understand why, but his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. For the first time in his life, he hadn't been turned away. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The back door creaked open, and Brutus's body tensed. A woman, Oliver's mother no doubt, stepped outside. Brutus knew this part. She would see him, her face would twist with fear, and this fragile moment would shatter. He had overstayed his welcome. But Oliver turned to her before she could react. "Mommy, look! I found a dog!" Brutus braced himself. The woman's eyes widened. Her body stiffened. Brutus could already see the fear creeping into her face. It was time to go. With one last glance at Oliver, Brutus took a step back. "No, wait!" Oliver cried, pressing his hands against the fence. "Don't go!" Brutus hesitated. The woman looked between them, her expression conflicted. She didn't tell Oliver to back away, but she didn't step forward either. She was unsure. Brutus knew better than to push his luck. He turned and slipped back into the fading light of dusk, but as he disappeared into the night, he carried something with him that he hadn't felt in a long, long time: hope. And for the first time since he had escaped his old life, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was still a place in this world for a dog like him. The moment shattered like glass. 1 second, Brutus felt the warmth of Oliver's tiny hand against his nose, something so foreign yet comforting that he barely knew how to react. And then, the sharp sound of a scream ripped through the quiet evening. Claire. She was standing in the doorway, her body tense, eyes wide with fear as she took in the sight before her. Her son, her little boy, was only inches away from a stray pit bull, a massive, scarred, unknown animal. Brutus immediately felt the shift in the air. He had been here before. He had seen this expression 100 times, felt the weight of terror pressing down on him like a suffocating force. He took a step back. "Oliver, get away from that dog." Claire's voice was high-pitched, frantic. Brutus flinched. It was happening again. The rejection, the fear, the inevitable truth that no matter what he did, no matter how still he stood or how quiet he remained, people would always see him as a threat. Oliver, on the other hand, didn't move. He didn't pull his hand back. His tiny fingers curled around the metal bars of the fence, as if he were afraid Brutus would disappear if he let go. "But, Mom, he's not bad," Oliver said, his voice filled with innocent certainty. "He's just hungry." Claire's breath came fast, shallow. She looked at her son, then back at Brutus, her mind racing with all the warnings she had ever heard. Stories of dangerous dogs, of pit bulls with unpredictable tempers. She didn't know where this dog had come from, what it had been through, or what it was capable of. All she knew was that her child was standing too close to something she couldn't control. Behind her, heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden porch. James. Unlike Claire, he didn't hesitate. He acted the way any father would when faced with an unknown threat to his family. He grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a wooden stick leaning against the house. His grip was tight, knuckles white as he stepped forward, positioning himself between Brutus and his son. Brutus saw it all unfold in an instant. The tightening of the man's shoulders, the firm set of his jaw. He had been trained to recognize aggression, to sense danger before it struck. But he didn't run. He could have. He should have. But something in Oliver's unwavering trust made his paws stay rooted to the ground. James's voice was firm, unwavering. "Get away from my son." Brutus remained still. His body language spoke louder than words. No raised hackles, no defensive stance, no growl rumbling from his throat, just stillness. Because he knew how this worked. He had learned, long ago, that fighting back only made things worse. The moment he showed his teeth, the moment he moved too fast or too suddenly, he would no longer be seen as a stray dog. He would become a monster. So Brutus did what he had done countless times before. He lowered his head. He let his tail drop. He showed them what they wanted to see. A dog that knew he was not wanted. James hesitated. He had expected snarling, bared teeth, some sign of aggression. But there was none. Just a dog standing quietly, ears flat, as if it had already accepted whatever fate awaited it. "Dad, stop!" Oliver pleaded. "He's not bad. He didn't do anything." James's grip tightened on the stick, but doubt flickered in his expression. He glanced at Claire, expecting her to reinforce his stance. But she was frozen in place. Her gaze wasn't on the dog anymore. It was on her son. Oliver was standing there, inches away from a dog that should have been terrifying. And yet, he wasn't scared. He wasn't even cautious. He was just there. Brutus felt the moment stretch, tension coiling in the air like an invisible rope about to snap. He had been in too many situations like this to expect anything different. This was the part where the man would lunge forward, where the first blow would come crashing down. Brutus had learned how to take a hit, but Oliver moved first. He stepped between his father and Brutus, his little arms spread wide as if he could somehow shield the dog from whatever was coming next. "Please don't hurt him," Oliver said, his voice small but firm. Brutus's breath hitched. James faltered. Claire let out a shaky exhale, pressing a hand to her chest. For a moment, everything was still, and then James lowered the stick. Not all the way. Not yet. But just enough. Brutus didn't dare move. He had survived by learning to read people, by recognizing the small shifts in their expressions, the way their energy changed in an instant. And right now, James wasn't looking at him like he was a monster. He was looking at him like something he didn't understand. Brutus swallowed hard. He had been given a chance, a small one, a fragile one, but a chance nonetheless. Oliver turned to Brutus, a triumphant smile on his face, as if he had just done the impossible, and in a way, he had. Brutus had expected the boy to run. Instead, Oliver crouched down, pressing his small hands against the fence again. "You're okay," he whispered. Brutus didn't know what to do with that. No one had ever told him that before. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He still looked wary, still looked ready to intervene if anything changed, but he didn't raise the stick again. Claire took a step closer. She wasn't convinced, but something in her eyes had softened. Brutus knew he had not won them over. Not yet. But he had not been chased away. That was more than he had ever hoped for. And so, he waited. Because for the first time in his life, there was something worth waiting for. Brutus didn't leave. He knew he should. He had spent his life running, always moving before the inevitable rejection, before the fear in their eyes turned into something worse. But this time, his paws remained rooted to the ground. The boy had asked him to stay. So, Brutus stayed. Not too close. He wasn't foolish enough to push his luck. He remained at the bottom of the porch steps, just out of reach, his body curled in a tight ball. His ribs ached from hunger, his muscles stiff from exhaustion, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to be still. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and something warm drifting from inside the house. It smelled like home. Brutus had never had one of those before, not really. He had known cages and chains, alleyways and empty streets. Never a home. The door creaked open again, and Brutus stiffened. Oliver. The boy stepped onto the porch, his small feet barely making a sound. In his hands, he clutched something. Small, round, golden brown. Food. Brutus's nose twitched involuntarily as the scent reached him. He had eaten garbage before, scavenged whatever he could find, but this smelled different. This was something given, not stolen. Oliver crouched, balancing on the edge of the porch, and held out the small biscuit. "Here," he whispered. "You have to be hungry." Brutus didn't move. This was a test. It had to be. He had failed enough of them to know how they worked. The moment he lunged for the food, the moment he moved too fast, too eagerly, the kindness would disappear. He had learned long ago that taking what wasn't explicitly his often came with consequences. Oliver didn't seem to notice Brutus's hesitation. He scooted forward an inch and placed the biscuit on the ground. Then, with the same quiet certainty, he sat back and waited. Brutus's stomach twisted with hunger, but he stayed still. He knew better than to take what wasn't meant for him. A minute passed, then another. Oliver sighed, tilting his head. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his voice full of something Brutus couldn't quite name. "It's for you." Brutus wanted to believe him. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his head and stretched his neck forward. His nose brushed against the biscuit, and he waited for the sound of a door slamming shut, for the sudden movement that meant he had overstayed his welcome. It never came. Oliver just watched. Brutus opened his mouth and, with the gentlest touch, took the biscuit. Oliver grinned. "See? Not so bad, right?" Brutus didn't know how to answer that. He had never had something freely given to him before. Never had a meal that wasn't earned through pain or stolen in desperation. He swallowed, his body still tense, waiting for the moment when everything would change. But nothing happened. Oliver simply sat there, swinging his legs, humming under his breath as if feeding a stray dog in the middle of the night was the most natural thing in the world. Brutus didn't understand it. He didn't understand Oliver. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't being pushed away. The screen door creaked open again, and Brutus's ears flattened. His eyes flickered to the doorway where Claire stood, watching. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't lunging forward to pull Oliver away, but she wasn't stepping closer either. Her hands were wrapped tightly around herself, and in her eyes Brutus saw something he had seen many times before. Fear, not just of him, but of what he represented. Brutus didn't move. He had already been allowed too close. He knew his place. If she wanted him gone, he would go. But Claire didn't say anything. She only turned her gaze from Brutus to her son, who was still smiling as if this moment was something special. Brutus didn't know if it was. He only knew that it was different. James appeared behind Claire, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't holding the stick anymore, but Brutus hadn't forgotten the way he had gripped it earlier. James wasn't convinced. Claire wasn't convinced. And yet, they didn't chase him away. Brutus swallowed hard. He had never been given a chance before. He didn't know what to do with it. James narrowed his eyes. Doesn't look like he's leaving. Claire didn't respond, but her silence said enough. Oliver perked up. Can he stay? James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We don't even know where he came from. Oliver shrugged. From the fence. James shot him a look, but Oliver just grinned. Claire finally spoke. He's a stray, Oliver. We don't know if he's safe. Oliver's smile faded just a little. He hasn't done anything bad. That was true. Brutus had done nothing but wait. Claire exhaled slowly. We'll figure it out in the morning, she murmured, turning toward the door. Oliver, come inside. Oliver hesitated. Can I give him one more? Claire wavered, then nodded. Just one. Oliver turned back to Brutus, holding out another biscuit, and Brutus felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't a home. Not yet. But for the first time in his life, Brutus had a reason to stay. The night was still. Brutus lay curled up at the foot of the porch, his body relaxed, but his senses always alert. The past few days had been different. So different from anything he had known before. He was still unsure if he belonged here, still waiting for the moment when he would be pushed away like always. But for now, he stayed. Oliver had asked him to stay. That had been enough. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves as a breeze passed through the trees. The boy was inside, safe, tucked into bed. Brutus had watched him through the window earlier, his small frame wrapped in blankets, his breathing slow and steady. There had been something oddly comforting about it. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was guarding something worth protecting. Then, a sound. Brutus's ears flicked up, a faint scuff against the pavement, a footstep, slow and deliberate. He lifted his head, muscles tensing. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the yard. At first, there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. But then, the shadow moved. A figure stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp, and the moment Brutus saw him, his entire body went rigid. The scent hit him first. It was buried beneath the layers of sweat, alcohol, and smoke. But it was there. Faint, but unmistakable. Brutus knew that scent. And then, the man laughed. A low, cold chuckle that made something primal rise within Brutus. Well, well, the man drawled, taking another step forward. His gaze swept the yard before settling on Brutus. I thought you were dead. Brutus didn't move. He didn't blink, but his tail lowered, his body coiled tight. He knew this man. The memories came rushing back in sharp, brutal flashes. The cold sting of a chain around his neck, the burn of fists against his ribs, the roar of a crowd as he was thrown into the pit. This man, this monster had once owned him, and now He was here. Brutus's breath came slow, steady, but his heart pounded against his ribs. He knew what this meant. He had seen this before, had lived this before. The man took another step closer. "Didn't think I'd find you in a place like this," he mused, tilting his head. "What, you got yourself a family now?" He snorted. "That's cute." Brutus barely heard him. His ears were ringing, his vision tunneling. Run. That was the first instinct. It had been his only option for so long. Run before the pain, before the chain tightened, before the blows rained down. Run because there was no other choice. But then, behind him, the house creaked. Brutus's ears twitched. A small sound, a shift in weight against the wooden floorboards. Someone was awake, someone was watching. And in that moment, Brutus realized something. This wasn't like before. He wasn't in a cage. He wasn't in the pit. He wasn't alone. He had a choice. The man smirked. "Come on, boy. Let's go. You remember how this works." Brutus stood, his body uncurled in a slow, deliberate motion. He lifted his head, squared his shoulders, and he didn't move. The smirk on the man's face twitched. "What? You think you belong here?" He let out another laugh. "You think they want you? They'll turn on you the second they see what you really are." Brutus knew that was a lie. Maybe once it would have been true. Maybe once he would have believed it. But not now. Not after Oliver. Not after Claire. Not after the nights spent waiting, watching, being given something he had never known before. A chance. The man clicked his tongue. "Fine. You want to make this difficult?" He reached into his pocket. Brutus moved before he even thought about it. His body surged forward, placing himself between the man and the house. His muscles bunched, his stance wide. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, vibrating through the air. The man froze. Brutus could see it in his eyes, the split-second shift from arrogance to hesitation. He wasn't supposed to act like this. He was supposed to obey, to submit. But Brutus wasn't that dog anymore. He bared his teeth. The man took a step back. "You don't want to do this." Brutus didn't move. The man swallowed. "Fine, whatever. Stay here and rot." He turned, muttering under his breath, and disappeared into the night. Brutus didn't move until he was sure the man was gone, until the scent faded, until the footsteps disappeared. Then, slowly, he exhaled. The porch light flicked on. Brutus turned his head. Claire stood in the doorway, her face pale. James was behind her, his expression unreadable. And then, small and sleepy-eyed, Oliver appeared. Brutus tensed. Would this be it? Would they push him away now, knowing what he had come from, what had almost happened? But Oliver just smiled. He padded forward, bare feet against the porch, and without hesitation, wrapped his arms around Brutus's neck. "You're a good boy," he whispered. Brutus blinked. James stepped forward. He looked at Brutus for a long moment, then nodded. "Come inside," he said. Brutus hesitated, but only for a second. Then he followed them home. The house felt different. For the first time since Brutus had arrived, there was no tension lingering in the air, no cautious glances or hushed discussions about what to do with him. He had always known when he wasn't wanted, could sense the hesitation in every movement, every wary glance. But now, after what had happened that night, something had shifted. James had been the one to open the door and invite him inside. That alone was enough to tell Brutus that things were no longer the same. He had slept near Oliver's bed that night, his body curled up in the warm glow of the nightlight. He hadn't meant to stay so close. Old habits still warned him to keep his distance, but Oliver had fallen asleep with one hand resting against Brutus's fur, and for some reason he hadn't been able to move away. It was the first time he had ever slept without fear. The morning brought a sense of quiet acceptance. No one rushed him out the door. No one threw cautious looks his way. Claire had still been hesitant, her movements careful, but she hadn't asked James what they should do with him. And James... James had barely looked at him at all. Brutus didn't expect anything from the man. James had made his stance clear from the beginning. Brutus wasn't meant to stay. He was a stray, an unknown. James was a protector, a father. And Brutus had been something unpredictable, something to be wary of. But Brutus had chosen to stand his ground when it mattered, and James had seen that. It was late in the afternoon when the man finally acknowledged him. Brutus was lying on the porch, the sun warming his fur, when he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He lifted his head as James stepped out, closing the door behind him. Something in his hand caught the light as he walked toward the house. Brutus watched as James stopped in front of him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then James sighed and crouched down, holding out what he had been carrying. A collar. Brutus blinked. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling as if this decision had taken more out of him than he was willing to admit. "I was wrong about you," he murmured. His voice wasn't rough, wasn't sharp. It was quiet, honest. Brutus stayed still. James turned the collar over in his hands. "I didn't want to trust you," he admitted. "Didn't want to believe you could be different." Brutus lowered his head slightly, waiting for the words that usually came after. But James just shook his head and reached forward. Brutus tensed, but James's touch wasn't harsh. His fingers brushed against Brutus's fur as he slipped the collar around his neck, buckling it into place. It was a simple thing, just a piece of leather, a silver tag hanging from it. But to Brutus, it meant something more. "You're not a stray anymore," James said quietly. Brutus let out a slow breath. "Welcome home." Brutus had spent his whole life being told what he was. A fighter, a stray, a problem. But no one had ever called him home. Oliver burst through the door a second later, his face lighting up as he noticed the collar. "Dad, you got him one," James huffed, standing up. "Figured it was about time." Oliver practically tackled Brutus in excitement, wrapping his arms around him. "That means you're really staying." Brutus let out a small, contented huff as Oliver hugged him tighter. Claire appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Brutus met her gaze, still uncertain where he stood with her. James had accepted him. Oliver had loved him from the start, but Claire had been the most afraid. But now, she didn't look afraid. Instead, she let out a soft sigh and stepped back into the house. "Come inside," she said, not unkindly. Oliver beamed. "Come on, Brutus." Brutus hesitated for only a moment before following them in. Inside, the air smelled different, rich, warm, something familiar but distant. The scent of food, but not just scraps or stolen meals, something meant for him. Claire was at the kitchen counter, placing a bowl onto the floor. Brutus froze. He knew what this was, but never, not once in his life, had a meal been placed in front of him without expectation, without a price. But Claire didn't ask anything of him. She just looked at him, her face softer than it had ever been. "You should eat," she said. Brutus stepped forward hesitantly, glancing at her again as if waiting for the moment the kindness would be snatched away. It never came. He lowered his head, his stomach twisting in hunger as he took his first bite. Oliver giggled. "He likes it." Claire crossed her arms, shaking her head, but there was something close to amusement in her expression. "He better. I made it for him." Brutus stilled. She had made it for him. It wasn't scraps. It wasn't something tossed in his direction as an afterthought. It was his. Brutus swallowed hard. He wasn't a fighter anymore. He wasn't a stray. He was theirs. And for the first time, he was home. The house was quiet. Soft moonlight filtered through the window, casting a silver glow over the room. The night air was cool, but inside everything felt warm, safe. The steady rhythm of Oliver's breathing filled the space, a quiet, soothing sound that Brutus had grown familiar with over the past few days. Brutus lay curled up beside the bed, his body relaxed against the rug. He was close enough to feel the boy's warmth, to hear the gentle rise and fall of his chest. A week ago, he wouldn't have dared to settle so near. He wouldn't have trusted the silence, wouldn't have allowed himself to rest. But tonight was different. For the first time in his life, Brutus slept with both eyes closed. There were no sharp footsteps approaching, no angry voices, no need to stay alert for the next blow. No one was going to rip him from this place, drag him back to the darkness he had once known. He had no reason to run. He had a reason to stay. A faint creak echoed through the hallway, and instinctively Brutus's ears twitched. The old him would have snapped awake, muscles tensed, ready to flee or fight. But the fear didn't come. His body didn't jolt, his breath didn't quicken. Instead, he let out a quiet sigh and settled deeper into the floor. The noise wasn't a threat. It was just the house settling, just James checking the doors, just Claire shifting in her sleep. Just the sounds of a home. His home. Brutus hadn't known what belonging felt like until now. He had spent too many nights curled in alleyways, too many mornings waking up to the ache of hunger, to the cold bite of loneliness. He had never been part of anything before. He had never been wanted. Now, he was. Oliver stirred, rolling onto his side, his hand reaching out unconsciously. His fingers brushed against Brutus's fur, and even in sleep, the boy smiled. Brutus closed his eyes. He had always thought he was meant to be alone. He had never been more wrong. The next morning, the air buzzed with something different. Laughter, lightness. Brutus watched from his spot by the couch as Oliver darted around the living room, his small feet barely touching the floor. Claire stood by the kitchen, shaking her head in amusement as she tried to get him to sit still. James sat near the fireplace, a camera in hand. "Oliver, hold still," Claire said, though her tone lacked any real sternness. "But we have to do it now," Oliver insisted, his excitement making his words tumble over each other. He turned to Brutus, his bright eyes wide with anticipation. "Come on, buddy, you have to be in this one." Brutus blinked. Oliver clapped his hands. "Come on, Brutus. It's a family picture." A family picture. Brutus had never been in one of those before. Oliver rushed over, throwing his arms around Brutus's neck in an unbothered, familiar way. He wasn't afraid of getting too close. He had never been afraid. "Sit next to me," Oliver said, tugging gently. Brutus hesitated only for a second before following. Oliver plopped onto the floor, patting the space beside him. Brutus settled down, his body sinking into the warmth of the room, into the comfort of the people around him. Claire stood behind them, resting a hand on Oliver's shoulder. James adjusted the camera, muttering something about getting the angle right. Brutus didn't understand the fuss, but he understood one thing. He was meant to be here. For the first time, he wasn't watching from the sidelines. He wasn't an outsider looking in. He wasn't lingering near a family that wasn't his, wishing for something that would never be. He was in the picture. He was part of it. "Ready?" James asked. Oliver grinned. "Ready." James clicked the button. The flash went off. And just like that, Brutus became part of a memory, one that wouldn't fade, one that wouldn't be taken away. A memory where he wasn't astray, a memory where he was home. This heartwarming story is more than just one of many dog stories. It's a powerful testament to resilience, trust, and the quiet strength of second chances. It reminds us that even the most broken souls, whether human or animal, can find healing in love and acceptance. Brutus's journey is not just about a stray dog finding a home. It's about overcoming fear, about learning that one's past does not define one's future. Through patience and understanding, an abandoned, forgotten creature transforms into a beloved member of a family, proving that kindness has the power to rebuild even the most shattered spirits. The story highlights how children often see the world without the prejudice that adults carry, and how true connections are formed through trust rather than fear. At its core, this is a story about belonging, about how love isn't something we earn, but something freely given when we allow ourselves to be seen. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes the ones we fear the most are the ones who need love the most. And in the end, a home is not just a place, it's the people who choose to welcome you in. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.